The wind swept across the dry, sun-baked plains, carrying the scent of dust, sage, and distant pine. The kind of wind that whispered stories to anyone willing to listen, tales of hard work, quiet despair, and stubborn hope. At the edge of the small, weathered ranch, a lone figure appeared. Trudging along the rough dirt path, her worn boots scuffing against the rocks and the brittle grass. She carried a bundle of rags tied with a thin piece of rope, and though the sun burned her shoulders, she pulled her thin shawl tighter, as if it could shield her from the judgmental eyes of the world. Her name didn't matter to most folks in town. She was one of those people who moved quietly, never asking for attention, never daring to take more than what the land or the good graces of others offered. But on this particular morning, she had decided to knock on the door of a man whose presence in the county was as solid as the hills themselves. A man known to all as the rancher. He was a tall figure, broad-shouldered, his hands calloused and strong from years of guiding cattle, mending fences, and battling the merciless seasons. Yet beneath his rugged exterior, there was a sorrow that few had ever glimpsed, a weight he carried quietly like a secret too heavy to speak aloud. She hesitated at the edge of the porch, her heart hammering as if it would betray her thoughts. The porch itself creaked under the weight of memories, of laughter that had long since faded, of storms weathered alone. The rancher appeared in the doorway, his hat tipped low to shade his eyes from the relentless sun. For a long moment he said nothing, studying the fragile figure before him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. There were many who came and went, seeking work, seeking shelter, seeking kindness, but he had learned long ago that trust was earned, not given. "I'm not worth much, sir," she whispered, her voice trembling, almost lost in the wind. "But I can cook." The words were simple, humble, almost painfully honest, and yet there was a quiet strength hidden in them, a promise of perseverance despite hardship. The rancher's gaze lingered on her, tracing the lines of worry etched across her young face, the way her fingers clutched the bundle like a lifeline. There was something about her that tugged at a part of him he had thought long, buried the part that still believed in second chances, in the quiet beauty of people who bore their pain in silence. He didn't respond right away. The ranch had its own rhythm, the cattle grazing in the fields, the wind whispering secrets through the barn rafters. He could see that she was tired, more than tired, bone-weary, from a life that had offered little but hard lessons in closed doors. And yet here she was, standing at his threshold, offering what she could, not demanding more than her hands could give. That alone stirred something within him, a memory of someone he had once loved, someone who had worked tirelessly in the kitchen while he wrestled with his own burdens. The memory hurt, sharp as the edge of a knife, but it was also a reminder that people were capable of courage in the smallest acts. The rancher shifted his weight, the gravel crunching under his boots as he stepped closer. He wanted to ask her why she was here, what had brought her to this lonely corner of the world, but his voice caught in his throat. There were questions he did not want to ask because answers often carried weight, and some weights were better left unlifted. Instead, he simply nodded, motioning toward the porch swing. "Sit for a spell," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. She obeyed, settling onto the worn wood, her fingers brushing against the peeling paint as if to steady herself. The silence stretched, comfortable yet charged with something neither of them wanted to name. She glanced around, taking in the barn where shadows played among the beams, the corral with its fence half-mended, the wide expanse of fields that seemed to roll endlessly into the horizon. It was a landscape both harsh and forgiving, much like the lives it sheltered. Her eyes met the rancher's again, and in that moment, a quiet understanding passed between them. She had stories, secrets, wounds, carried too long in solitude. He had burdens, regrets, and scars that no one had ever seen. And somehow, in that quiet morning light, the two of them recognized that they might be able to offer each other something rare, a chance to start again, even if only in small, cautious steps. She reached into her bundle and pulled out a small, tattered notebook. The pages filled with recipes and notes scribbled in her careful handwriting. "I've cooked for folks before," she murmured, almost as if admitting a sin, "not much. But I can make do with what I have." There was a humility in her words, but also a hint of defiance, a spark that refused to be snuffed out. If the rancher studied her, noting the determination behind the fear, life had knocked her down, yes, but it hadn't broken her. That realization made his chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in years. "Cooking, huh?" finally said. a faint edge of amusement in his tone, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Round here, that's a skill that matters, especially when the work's hard and the nights are longer than the days. He paused, scratching at his beard, the wind tugging at loose strands of hair. Sure you're ready for this life? It's not just about pots and pans. It's about sweat and worry, and sometimes heartbreak too. His words hung between them, a warning, a truth she already knew but perhaps wasn't willing to voice. I can do it, she said, her voice steadier now, more resolute. I've done hard work before. I can do more if I have to. I need a chance. There was a raw honesty in her plea that made him pause, forcing him to confront his own vulnerabilities. He had been alone for too long, guarding himself against disappointment, yet there was a stirring in his chest that refused to be ignored. Could he allow someone else into this world of dust and sweat, of endless labor and quiet despair? Could he risk the ache that came with caring for someone again? The rancher turned toward the horizon, letting his gaze wander over the rolling fields and the distant mountains that framed the town. He had secrets of his own, memories too heavy to share, a past shadowed by decisions he could never undo. And now, standing at his porch, this young woman had unwittingly pressed against the barriers he had built around himself. There was something in her, something that mirrored the hope he had once felt and lost. As the sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the worn wood and the dusty fields, the air between them seemed to thrum with unspoken promises and fragile hope. Neither spoke, yet both felt the weight of what could come, the possibility of trust, the risk of heartbreak, the chance for a life slightly less lonely than before. But just as he opened his mouth to speak, a distant sound cut through the quiet, the shrill cry of a horse. A warning that the world beyond their small porch still held challenges neither of them could yet foresee. Her eyes widened, the color draining from her face, and she clutched the notebook tighter. The rancher straightened, his jaw hardening as instinct took over. Something was coming, something that would demand courage from both of them, something that might test their resolve before either had a chance to truly begin. He looked at her, a silent question in his eyes, and she nodded ever so slightly, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Neither of them spoke again, for words would not be enough not yet. The wind whipped through the ranch, carrying with it the scent of the unknown, and the world seemed to hold its breath as the first act of their story began, fragile and uncertain, like the ember of a fire waiting to be fanned into life. The shrill cry of the horse faded into the distance, but its echo lingered in the still air, pressing against the quiet that had settled over the ranch. The young woman clutched her notebook as though it were a shield, her knuckles white against the thin cover. The rancher's eyes narrowed, scanning the horizon where dust swirled in little columns, hinting at movement he couldn't yet place. The land had a way of hiding things, of keeping secrets until it chose to reveal them, and he had long since learned that patience and caution were as necessary as strong hands and a steady gaze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, almost too softly to be heard, her voice trembling despite her best effort at calm. "I did," he said, his tone low, carrying that same quiet authority that had kept men in line and cattle from wandering for years. He moved toward the corral, boots crunching against the dry earth, eyes scanning the far edges of the property where the dust had risen. He gestured for her to stay on the porch, though she didn't argue. Somehow, she trusted him enough to stay, even though she barely knew him. That trust, fragile and unspoken, was dangerous, but it was also what made her presence here so different from every other drifter who had ever passed through. The rancher's mind drifted as he watched the horizon. There were things about this place he had never shared with anyone, stories hidden in the folds of the hills. Memories buried beneath layers of dust and time. Nights spent worrying over crops that might fail, over cattle lost to sickness or storm, over decisions that could ripple across the land and change lives forever. And then there was the secret he carried deeper than all of that, the heartbreak he had never dared to speak aloud. It was the reason he had built walls so high around himself, why no one had ever come close enough to see the man behind the rough exterior. The young woman sat quietly on the porch, her gaze drifting to the barn where shadows lingered, her mind tracing the path that had brought her here. She hadn't always lived a life on the run, but the past few years had been hard enough to carve themselves into her bones. She had learned to fend for herself, to find work wherever she could, to hide the fear and uncertainty that gnawed at her whenever someone asked too many questions. And yet, standing on this porch, looking into the eyes of the rancher. She felt something she hadn't allowed herself in a long time, a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was a place where she could belong, if only she could prove herself useful, if only she could show that she had more to give than the world had allowed her to believe. The wind shifted again, and with it came the faint sound of hooves striking the hard earth, closer this time. The rancher's hand rested on the rail of the corral, tents ready. He had seen trouble before, neighbors squabbling over water rights, rustlers trying to take what wasn't theirs, storms that threatened to undo months of labor in a single night, but there was something different about this. The rhythm of the hooves was deliberate, measured, almost like a warning. He could feel it in his bones. This wasn't random. "You've been on your own long?" he asked suddenly, not taking his eyes from the horizon. She hesitated, thinking of how much to reveal. There were parts of her story she would never tell, parts that were too painful, too humiliating to share. But a kernel of honesty lodged in her chest, pushing itself out despite her fears. "Long enough to know how to take care of myself," she said finally. "And long enough to know that some folks don't get second chances." The rancher's gaze softened, though the tension in his body didn't ease. "Second chances are rare," he admitted, almost to himself. "But sometimes they find you when you least expect it." His words were heavy with experience, and she felt the weight of them settle over her, grounding her in a way the wind and the sun could not. The sound of hooves grew louder, echoing across the valley. She could see dust curling in the distance, forming a faint line that moved closer with every heartbeat. She rose from the porch, instinctively pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The rancher turned toward her, his expression unreadable. She realized he was already planning, calculating, assessing the threat before it even arrived. There was a quiet power in him, one that didn't rely on words, that spoke of years spent surviving harsh winters, of nights where the moon was the only witness to one's thoughts. "You might want to step back," he said, his voice calm but edged with warning. She nodded, retreating toward the steps, her fingers brushing the rough wood as if grounding herself against fear. She noticed how the wind shifted again, carrying scents she hadn't expected: smoke, dust, and something faintly metallic, like the smell of old iron. Her stomach twisted, a warning she couldn't ignore. The rancher didn't move from his spot near the corral. Instead, he rested a hand on the gate, his other hovering near the holster at his side. He had faced plenty of threats before, but this felt different. There was intent in the movement, a deliberate pace that suggested whoever or whatever was coming wasn't just passing through. He had always believed that life on the plains taught a person to read more than just the land. You read the wind, the animals, the dust, the very rhythm of existence, and in that reading you learned who belonged and who meant trouble. The young woman watched him, a mixture of awe and fear churning in her chest. There was a mystery about him, a depth she couldn't fully understand, but she could sense it in the lines of his face, in the way he carried himself, and the silent authority that radiated from him like heat from a fire. She realized she wanted to know more, not just about the land, but about him, about the secrets he carried and the heartache he had buried. But there was no time for questions now. The dust cloud on the horizon had grown, and she could make out the figure of a rider, moving with purpose. Something in her stomach clenched. This was no neighbor checking in, no traveler lost on the plains. This was someone who had a reason to find the rancher, someone who carried the weight of confrontation with them. She felt the pull of instinct, the same instinct that had kept her alive on countless nights alone, and she clenched the notebook in her hand like a talisman. The rancher's eyes never left the approaching figure. His jaw tightened, the lines of his face hardening with concentration. He didn't speak, but she could feel the intensity, the tension of someone used to facing danger without flinching. She had never seen that before, not up close, not in anyone who had ever crossed her path. There was something magnetic about it, something that drew her in, even as fear tried to push her back. The rider was close enough now that she could make out the shape of a hat, the glint of a weapon at the hip, the dust clinging to boots that had traveled hard and far. There was no hesitation in the figure's approach, no uncertainty. And though she didn't understand why, her chest tightened. And she realized that whatever was about to happen, it was tied to the rancher, tied to secrets he had kept locked away. Secrets that were now stirring to the surface. She swallowed hard, trying to calm the thrum of fear and curiosity in her chest. She wanted to turn away, to run back the way she had come. But something held her in place, something in the way the rancher stood, steady and unyielding, as though he could face whatever was coming without faltering. And perhaps, she thought, that was why she had come here in the first place, not just for work, not just for shelter, but for the chance to witness strength, to glimpse courage that could carry them both through the storm that was surely on its way. The rider's shadow stretched across the corral as they drew nearer, the sound of hooves striking the dirt a drumbeat that matched the racing of her heart. She could feel the tension coil in the air, the promise of confrontation and revelation, of truths that had long been hidden. And in that moment she realized that nothing about this ranch, about this man, or about her own future would ever be simple again.
Ow.
The past and present were colliding, and the first chapter of their story was about to be written in dust and sweat, in fear and bravery, in choices that could not be undone. The rancher's hand tightened on the gate, the wind tugging at his coat, and he exhaled slowly. "Let's see what brings you here," he murmured, more to himself than to her, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. The unknown had arrived, and with it, the promise of change, of secrets revealed, of a story that had only just begun. The rider drew closer, the figure now fully visible against the late morning sun. Dust clung to every inch of their clothes, and the reins of the horse were held with an ease that spoke of years spent in the saddle. The rancher's hand remained on the gate, steady as stone, his eyes locked on the newcomer. There was recognition in his gaze, a flicker of wariness, and something else he did not allow himself to feel, often fear. The wind picked up again, tugging at the hems of their coats, whipping the dust into a haze that blurred the edges of the world. The young woman stepped back, the notebook clutched to her chest. Her pulse raced as she took in the rider's expression, sharp and unreadable beneath the shadow of the wide-brimmed hat. Whoever this was, they carried a purpose, and in that purpose she felt the first brush of danger, the kind that demanded every ounce of caution and courage. "You've been avoiding us," the rider called, voice carrying clearly despite the distance. "Thought we might find you hiding behind the hills." The words hit the rancher with a weight he could not ignore. His jaw tightened, and he shifted his stance, planting his boots firmly into the dirt. There was history here, history that didn't belong to the young woman, but had a way of pulling her into it, whether she wanted to be or not. "Not hiding," the rancher replied evenly, though the strain in his voice was audible. "Just managing my own business." There was a pause, a quiet that hung over the porch like a storm about to break. The rider's eyes narrowed, scanning the fields and the corral, lingering on the woman for a brief moment before returning to the man who had so long carried his own burdens in silence. "You think you can keep running from the past?" the rider said, dismounting with practiced ease. Every movement was careful, deliberate, and the way the boots hit the ground carried the sound of authority, of someone who expected obedience. The rancher did not flinch, but the tension in his shoulders spoke volumes. He had faced confrontation before, but this carried a history he could not ignore, a reckoning he had delayed far too long. The young woman felt her stomach twist. She had arrived at the ranch seeking work, seeking shelter, seeking a chance at a life that had never been kind. And now, without warning, she was caught in a story far larger than her own, a story shaped by secrets and choices she could barely understand. She shifted on the porch, instinct telling her to stay silent, to stay unseen, even as curiosity gnawed at her. There were truths here, hidden beneath layers of pride and pain, that could change everything. The rider moved closer, hands brushing against the horse's mane, as though grounding themselves before speaking again. "You can't protect her by yourself." The words came sharp, almost accusing, and the rancher's eyes flicked toward the woman. She caught the look, a fleeting shadow of worry, and realized that whatever this confrontation was about, it had consequences for her too. "I never asked to be protected," the rancher said, his tone low and deliberate, the kind of voice that had kept men and cattle in line for years. "And I don't need anyone telling me what I can or cannot do." There was a flicker of anger, but beneath it, a vulnerability he rarely allowed anyone to glimpse. The rider's gaze lingered on him, reading the lines of his face, the weight of years etched in every movement. The young woman swallowed, trying to process the tension that hung thick in the air. She had thought the hardest part of this life was survival, finding food, shelter, and work. But now she realized there were battles she could not predict. Battles tied to the histories of others, battles that demanded loyalty, judgment, and courage she had never been asked to summon before. The rider's voice cut again, this time quieter, almost a warning. You've carried too much alone for too long. It's time to face what's coming, before it's too late. The rancher's hands tightened on the gate, and he exhaled slowly, letting the dust settle around him. He wanted to respond, to defend himself, to explain the choices he had made. But he knew that words were not enough, not for what was coming, not for the past that had clawed its way back into the present. The young woman could see the storm in his eyes, the same storm she had glimpsed in the weathered land itself. Years of work, years of solitude, years of silent suffering, all converging in this moment, and she understood then that she had stumbled into something far more dangerous than she had imagined. The rancher's secrets were not just his own. They were alive, waiting, capable of shaping the lives of anyone nearby. She thought about the work she had come to offer, the meals she could cook, the hands she could lend, but it all seemed small now, insignificant compared to the weight of the tension crackling across the porch. And yet, even in fear, a spark of determination flared. She had survived before. She had faced uncertainty, hardship, and loneliness. And if this rancher's life depended on facing something he had long denied, then perhaps she could help, in ways that went beyond simple work. The rider's attention flicked to her, eyes sharp beneath the hat. Shouldn't be here. The words were a warning, a command disguised as caution. This isn't a place for someone like you. The young woman's fingers tightened around the notebook. She had heard such words before, but something about this time made them feel heavier, more dangerous. She could see the layers of history in the rancher's stance, in the way his jaw moved as he considered his response. He wasn't just defending himself, he was defending her too, in a way that wasn't yet spoken aloud. The wind shifted again, rustling the pages of her notebook. She caught glimpses of the recipes she had written in careful script, reminders of her own resilience and determination. They seemed trivial now, yet somehow they reminded her that even in the face of conflict, even in the presence of danger she barely understood, there was something she could offer. She was not helpless, she was not invisible, and perhaps if she proved herself, she could be more than she had ever imagined. The rider stepped closer, boots crunching against the gravel path. Every movement radiated purpose, and the young woman realized that this person had not come for idle talk. There was a reckoning coming, and she was already part of it. The rancher's eyes flicked to her, a silent warning, and she nodded. Understanding the gravity of the situation, even as fear twisted her stomach. "Time's almost up," the rider said, voice low but insistent. "You can keep running, but the past doesn't stay buried. It never does." The rancher's jaw tightened, and he glanced toward the hills, where shadows clung to the valleys, hiding secrets the sun could not fully reveal. He knew the truth of that statement. Secrets had a way of surfacing, dragging those who tried to ignore them into a reckoning that could not be avoided. The young woman felt a shiver run down her spine, a mixture of fear and anticipation. She had come seeking work, a place to belong, and a chance to prove herself. Instead, she had found herself caught in a web of history, loyalty, and danger, facing a storm she had not anticipated. And yet in that fear, she sensed a strange kind of clarity or realization that this was the life she had sought, all its unpredictability, and all its peril and possibility. The rancher took a step forward, his hands loosening slightly on the gate. "You've got one chance to leave," he said, voice hard, eyes locking on the rider. "One chance to turn back before things get worse." There was a tension there that went beyond words, a silent acknowledgement of stakes that neither the young woman nor the rider fully understood yet. The air seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the inevitable choice, the spark that would ignite the next stage of the conflict. The young woman felt her heart hammer in her chest. She understood then that the ranch was not just a place to work or a refuge from hardship. It was a battlefield of secrets, choices, and histories that demanded courage. She also understood that leaving was not an option. She had come too far, risked too much, and seen too clearly that whatever was coming, she could not turn away. The rider's shadow stretched long across the corral, and the wind kicked up again, dust curling around boots, hooves, and the edges of the young woman's shawl. As she could feel the pull of the past, of stories and mistakes, of choices that had been made in desperation, fear, and pride. And in that pull she realized that she had a part to play, that her presence here was no accident, and that the storm about to break was as much hers as it was anyone else's. The rancher's eyes flicked to her once more, a silent question lingering in the lines of his face. She nodded ever so slightly, signaling that she understood. They were in this together now, caught between history and present danger, between secrets long kept and consequences long delayed. The rider stopped just a few feet from the corral, the tension between the three of them palpable, crackling like lightning in the thick, dusty air. And as the wind whipped across the plains, carrying with it the scent of dry grass, iron, and uncertainty, the young woman realized that her life and the rancher's was about to change forever. The story she had stumbled into was no longer just about work or survival. It was about truth, courage, and the reckoning that could not be avoided, no matter how long the past had been ignored. The sun had dipped slightly lower, painting the plains in golden amber, streaked with shadow. Dust still lingered in the air, swirling around the corral, where the rider's horse pawed at the ground, restless and impatient. The rancher's eyes never left the newcomer, scanning every movement, reading the subtle shifts in stance. The way the horse shifted weight, the slight tension in the rider's shoulders. Years on the plains had taught him that danger rarely announced itself in bold gestures. It crept, it lingered, it struck when least expected, and it demanded respect. The young woman stood just behind the porch rail, her shawl clutched around her shoulders, her pulse hammering. She had faced hard days before and I'd spent walking endless roads, all cold winds cutting through ragged clothing, but nothing had felt like this. There was something in the rider's presence that pressed against the air like a storm cloud. Heavy, inevitable, a threat that couldn't be ignored. She could see the way the rancher's hand hovered near his belt, the subtle shift in his stance that spoke of readiness, of a man who had fought battles he would rather forget. "Why now?" the rancher asked finally, his voice low, steady, carrying the weight of years and exhaustion. There was no accusation in it, only a quiet demand for an answer. The rider's eyes glinted beneath the shadow of the hat, unreadable and sharp. "Because it can't stay hidden anymore," the rider replied, voice flat but firm. "You've kept it buried too long, and the land, the people. They're all caught in the ripple of what you've tried to forget." The young woman felt a shiver run through her. The words were pointed, heavy with meaning, though she had no idea what past the rider spoke of. Yet she could feel its weight pressing on the rancher, pressing on her. And she understood that she had stumbled into something far larger than work or shelter, far larger than the simple life she had hoped to find on this quiet ranch. The rancher's jaw tightened, and he looked toward the hills. "Some things," he said slowly, "are meant to be left alone. Some mistakes, some regrets. They carve their mark on a man, but they don't need to destroy everyone around him." His voice carried a weariness that hinted at pain to long carried. The rider stepped closer, the horse shifting beneath their weight, hooves striking the hard earth like a drumbeat of inevitability. "You can't protect her by staying silent," the rider said. And for a moment the wind seemed to die, leaving only the tension of their words. The rancher's eyes flicked to the young woman, a shadow of concern crossing his face. She met his gaze, silent and steady, and for a moment she saw the weight he carried decades of choices. Regrets and sorrow wrapped around him like a cloak too heavy to set down. Realized then that whatever this conflict was, it wasn't just about him. She was part of it now, whether she wanted to be or not. The rancher shifted the boards of the corral, groaning under his movement. "Some truths aren't safe to share," he said quietly, almost to himself. His voice carried a sadness that made her chest ache. He wanted to protect her from what lay beneath the past, from the heartbreak that had shadowed him for years. But there was no hiding it now. The rider's presence, the urgency in their stance, the deliberate approach they had forced the past into the present. The young woman gripped her notebook tighter, the pages rustling in the sudden gust of wind. It had been her anchor, her reminder that she had skills, value, a role to play. And now, as the tension thickened and the rider advanced another step, she understood that survival here would demand more than cooking or chores. It would demand courage, quick thinking, and perhaps even the kind of trust she had never dared to offer before. The rider's boots scuffed against the gravel. "It doesn't matter how long you've tried to bury it," they said, voice sharp and relentless. "The choices you made, they have consequences. And everyone who steps onto this land feels the ripple, including her." Their eyes flicked to the young woman, a silent acknowledgement of the danger she now faced. She felt her pulse spike, the notebook clutched to her chest as if it could somehow shield her from what was coming. The rancher exhaled slowly, his hands flexing at his sides. He could feel the weight of years pressing down on him. The accumulated regrets of decisions made in isolation, in desperation, in fear. And now, standing here, he faced the consequences not just for himself, but for the woman who had placed her trust in him, who had arrived quietly on his porch, offering only her willingness and her skills. Nothing more. "You shouldn't be involved," he said, voice low but firm, directed at the young woman, though she already knew it was more than a warning. It was a plea. "Stay back. Stay safe." "I won't leave," she said softly, but with a firmness that surprised even her. She had faced fear before, but this was different. This was personal, tangled in layers she could not yet fully understand. And yet, despite her fear, she felt a strange certainty. She was here for a reason. And whatever unfolded next, she could not step away. The rider took another step, closing the distance, and the tension between the three of them seemed to thrum in the air. The horse shifted uneasily, sensing the energy, the danger, the unspoken threat. The rancher's gaze hardened, his instincts sharpening as he calculated, assessed, prepared. Years of work on this land, years of surviving storms and isolation, had taught him that moments like this required patience and precision. One wrong move, and it could all unravel. The young woman's eyes darted between the two men, taking in the lines of tension in their bodies, the unspoken history, the silent warnings. She realized that the rancher's secret, whatever it was, had shaped his life in ways she could barely imagine. And now, the rider's arrival had forced it into the open. Threatening to pull them all into a reckoning, she was only beginning to understand. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the scent of dust, dry grass, and something faintly metallic, like the trace of old blood or iron. The young woman shivered, instinctively stepping closer to the rancher. Feeling a need for protection she had rarely admitted to herself. He glanced down at her, his eyes softening for the briefest moment, but then he turned back to the rider, tension coiling through his frame like a drawn bowstring. "You've waited long enough," the rider said finally, voice steady and cold. "It's time. No more hiding. No more running from what's been done." The rancher's hand brushed against the gate, a subtle preparation, a readiness that went beyond words. "I had been through confrontations before, but never like this, never with the past clawing back into the present so deliberately, so inevitably." He could see it in the rider's stance, hear it in the calm determination behind their words. This wasn't about idle threats or business disputes. This was about reckoning, about truths too long buried, about consequences that could no longer be ignored. The young woman felt her stomach tighten. She could see the tension radiating between the two men, a silent storm ready to break. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, to understand, but every instinct in her body screamed that words would not change what was about to unfold. All she could do was wait and hope and hold on. The rider took another step, the horse's hooves clattering against the corral's edge. Dust rose, swirling around their boots and the young woman's shawl. The rancher's gaze hardened, muscles coiling, and he inhaled slowly, preparing for whatever had been forced into this moment. He had spent years avoiding this confrontation, hiding from it, burying it beneath work, isolation, and the land itself. But it was here now, undeniable and unyielding, and it demanded everything he had to face it. The young woman felt her pulse quicken, the tension in the air almost suffocating. She could see the storm reflected in the rancher's eyes, the years of burden, the fear of what might come, the determination to protect her despite it all. She understood then that this moment would define everything that followed, that their choices here would ripple across their lives in ways she could not yet imagine. And as the wind swept across the plains, carrying dust, the scent of iron, and the promise of confrontation, the three of them stood, poised on the edge of something inevitable. Every heartbeat seemed to echo the tension in the land itself, a silent drumbeat of what was coming. The past and present had collided, the secrets and truths could no longer stay hidden, and the reckoning, the one they had all been running from, was about to begin. The rancher's hand flexed, the young woman tightened her grip on the notebook, and the rider's eyes never wavered. The moment stretched, taut with suspense, and the plains seemed to hold their breath alongside them. The first sparks of confrontation were in the air, the tension electric, and nothing in their lives would remain unchanged once it struck. This section builds maximum suspense, deepens the tension between the rancher, the rider, and the young woman, expands on subplots, and sets the stage for the climax without resolving any conflict yet. The wind had died down, as if the plains themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the storm to pass. The rider stopped at the edge of the corral, the horse stamping softly, sensing the tension that had finally reached its peak. For a long moment, no one spoke. The rancher's hand still hovered near his belt, though the muscles in his jaw had relaxed just slightly. The young woman stood closer to him now, notebook clutched to her chest, but not in fear. She had learned in these past days that fear had a way of sharpening the senses, but courage, that quiet, stubborn kind, carried its own strength. The rider's eyes softened just a fraction, the sharp edge of confrontation giving way to acknowledgement. "You couldn't run forever," they said quietly, tone stripped of accusation. "The truth always comes to light, and you couldn't hide her from it either." The rancher exhaled slowly, the weight of years pressing down on him in waves that threatened to crush, but also to release. "I wasn't hiding her," he said, voice hoarse but steady. "I was trying to protect her from the past, from mistakes I've carried too long." "From me?" The young woman blinked, sensing the depth of those words. She had seen glimpses of his sorrow, hints of regrets hidden behind a strong exterior. But this was more honest, more raw, more human than she could have imagined. She realized then that the man she had come to the ranch for help, for work, for a chance at a place to belong, carried a story that was as heavy as the land itself. And yet, in spite of it, he had kept going, kept surviving, kept living, even when hope seemed distant. The rider nodded, almost imperceptibly, a silent acknowledgement that whatever had happened in the past had been reckoned with now. There was no more need for anger, no more need for accusation. The tension that had clung to the air seemed to settle like dust after a long ride, leaving a quiet stillness in its place. The young woman took a step forward, then another, until she stood closer to the rancher. "You don't have to carry it alone," she said softly, her voice carrying through the open air. We can face it together." Her words were simple, almost fragile, yet filled with a courage that surprised even her. The rancher looked down at her eyes, meeting hers. And something shifted, something that had been buried under years of regret and isolation. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the rider tipped their hat slightly, as if granting permission, acknowledgement, and maybe even forgiveness, all at once. Without another word, they turned back to their horse, mounted, and rode off slowly, dust rising in their wake. The sound of hooves faded into the distance, leaving only the quiet hum of the plains and the rustle of the wind through the grass. The rancher sank onto the edge of the corral gate, finally allowing himself to release the tension he had held for so long. The weight of his secret, his heartbreak, the choices that had haunted him, all seemed a little lighter now, tempered by acknowledgement, by courage, by the presence of someone willing to stand by him even when the world had seemed unforgiving. The young woman sat beside him on the corral gate, resting her hands on her knees, notebook still in hand. "I've cooked for people before," she said quietly, almost to herself, "but I didn't think I'd ever cook for someone who needed this." Her words were simple, but they carried a depth of understanding she hadn't anticipated. She realized that survival wasn't just about meals or work or shelter, it was about connection, trust, and sharing the burdens that no one could carry alone. The rancher's voice was soft now, almost gentle. "You've done more than that already," he said, glancing at her. "You stayed, you listened, you didn't run when things got hard. That counts for more than any meal, more than any work around the ranch." He looked across the fields, where the dust still lingered, the cattle grazing quietly, the barn standing solid and silent. "This land, it tests people, it shows you who you are, what you're made of. And it's clear now that you belong here. It's not because of what you can do, but because of who you are." The young woman felt a warmth spread through her chest she hadn't felt in years. For the first time since she had arrived at this ranch, she felt like she had a place in the world, a role that mattered not for what she could offer physically, but for the courage and determination she carried. She realized that everyone carries their own battles, their own heartbreaks, their own secrets. And sometimes, the act of facing them, of sharing them, is the most powerful thing a person can do. The rancher pushed himself off the gate, dusting his hands on his trousers, and gestured toward the barn. "Come on," he said. "There's work to do, chores to finish, meals to prepare." But, for the first time in a long while, It won't feel like just survival. It'll feel like living. The young woman followed, her steps lighter than they had been when she first arrived, her eyes taking in the familiar sights of the ranch with a new sense of belonging. She could see the potential in every fence post, every worn board, every field stretched beneath the wide-open sky. And she could feel the bond forming between herself and the rancher, a bond forged in tension, in shared silence, in the courage to face what had been hidden for so long. Days passed, and the rhythm of the ranch slowly returned. The cattle moved through the pastures with steady predictability. The wind whispered through the hills as if telling stories it had carried for decades. And the young woman found her place in the routines. She cooked meals that warmed both body and heart, helped mend fences, fed the animals, and, most importantly, listened. She listened when the rancher shared pieces of his past, fragments of heartbreak and choices that had defined his solitude. And she shared pieces of her own journey, small truths that built trust, understanding, and a quiet strength between them. The rancher, in turn, began to open up in ways he hadn't in years. He spoke of the mistakes he had made, of losses that had cut deeper than any storm or drought, of decisions he had carried silently. And each time he spoke, the weight lifted a little, not because the past changed, but because someone had finally heard him. Someone had finally offered understanding without judgment. The young woman didn't have all the answers, but her presence, her courage, and her willingness to stay grounded in the truth made a difference he had long thought impossible. Evenings on the ranch became moments of reflection. The sun would set in brilliant streaks of orange and gold, the air cooling and carrying the smell of fresh earth and hay. The young woman would sit on the porch, notebook resting on her lap, jotting down recipes, thoughts, and dreams she hadn't dared voice before. The rancher would join her, leaning against the railing, sometimes silent, sometimes sharing stories of the land, the people, and the lessons it had taught him. And in those quiet moments, they discovered the most important truth, that life, no matter how hard, no matter how lonely, could still hold moments of connection, of hope, and of healing. One afternoon, as the wind stirred through the fields and the cattle grazed lazily, the young woman prepared a meal. The aroma of herbs, roasted vegetables, and fresh bread carried across the ranch, drawing the rancher into the kitchen. He watched her for a moment, quietly, and then, without a word, sat down at the table. There was no grand speech, no dramatic declaration, just the understanding that they had faced the past, confronted the threats, and arrived at a place where trust, courage, and resilience could thrive. The young woman smiled softly, placing a plate before him. "I'm not worth much, sir," she said quietly, echoing the words she had whispered on her first morning. "But I can cook." There was a lightness to her voice now, a strength and honesty born from experience, endurance, and the connection they had forged. The rancher's lips curved into a faint smile, a rare moment of warmth that spoke of relief, gratitude, and a cautious hope for the future. "You're worth more than you know," he replied simply. And in those words, she felt the weight of everything that had passed. The secrets, the heartbreak, the tension, they were still part of the land, still part of their lives, but no longer burdens that crushed them. They had faced the reckoning, and though the world remained unpredictable, they had each other. The plains stretched endlessly beyond the ranch, golden in the afternoon light, filled with the promise of seasons yet to come. Life would continue with its challenges, storms, and tests. But the young woman and the rancher had discovered something rare: resilience, understanding, and a bond born from hardship and courage. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the fields, they both understood that whatever storms awaited, they would face them together, one day, one moment, one choice at a time. The wind whispered through the corral, carrying dust and memories, but now it also carried a quiet peace.
Ow.
The rancher and the young woman shared a glance, silent acknowledgement of the journey they had endured and the future they were about to write together. It wasn't a story of perfection or certainty. It was a story of survival, hope, and the quiet, enduring courage of two people who had found each other on a windswept ranch, ready to face whatever came next, side by side.